Okay, good afternoon to everybody. Sorry I'm getting a little bit of a late start here. I was trying to make my way upstairs, or from upstairs to downstairs, and I left some things up there. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're only going to talk today about chapter 16. I mentioned to the class on Monday that we were going to skip chapter 15. So let me just reiterate that again, and I'll put some preliminary notes back up on the board here, and you can see those. And by the way, I know that we went over the third exam in class on Monday, and I know that I haven't posted the video for that yet. I realize I haven't done it, but I'm waiting. We had a transfer from another class come over to the section, and she has yet to take that exam. And our administration sort of allows some accommodation. So because I went over that exam, I think we'll have her done today, if not today, tomorrow. So I realize that has not been posted, but I'm aware of it, and I'll get that available to you as soon as possible. So what we're going to do today, this is the last remaining day of week 13, if you can believe it, and we're going to talk about chapter 16. And I just began a bit about it on Monday. And in my mind, chapter 16 is important, mostly because, to me, it occurs to me that having taught in business schools for a while, that one of the areas, in fact, and the fact that I've spoken outside in the business world, and one of the things that is sort of fed back to me is that one area that's not really covered so much, and people think it ought to be, is insurance, and what exactly it is, what it's about. And so I'm going to get into that just a little bit. And I realize for those of you who are very familiar with insurance, it's going to be a very, very introductory look at what insurance is. I once taught an entire insurance class for several semesters, and in that we only got into even a whole semester, 15 weeks. We didn't really only scratch the surface. It's a very, very deep subject. And in fact, there are entire degree programs dealing with insurance, and particularly, and then if you want to go to a specialized area like actuarial science, that's itself a separate program. So I realize there's a lot going on there, but I think the issue is how does it tie in microeconomically? That is, head of economic actors, which is really what we're talking about in micro economics and markets. How do these actors deal with dealing in markets where there are things that are unknown? And remember, the very first day of class, I said, in the definition of economics, I said it was the social science dealing with how people make decisions based upon income, uncertainty, and also and bad information. Uncertainty and bad information. So we're going to be talking a bit about that today, and a lot of those tie into insurance as one of those solutions to what we call information failures. Okay, so uncertain. So it was scarcity and uncertainty, I think, is really the way we sort of said it. So we're talking about that. Then when we come back next week, there's the final chapter in the course is going to be chapter 19. That's more of an international piece, and I do think it's maybe the only econ class you take, and I know that that's another area that we probably need to do better in, and that's talking more about the international dimension. I wish we could do more of it, both micro and macro, but unfortunately, we really just don't have the time. And we were squeezing it in when we had 16 weeks as a full semester. Now we only have 15 weeks, and so it's sort of being more compressed. But we're going to talk about that. When we come back on a week from today, we're going to review for the fourth exam, which is going to be next week. So we'll go over that, what to expect for that. So that exam will be available through that Sunday. And then when we come back on week 15, my plan was to, on the 17th, which is the first day of that week, go over really the first three exams. And if everyone has taken exams or exam 4, then I'd be more than glad to go over that as well, but my experience tells me it's probably unlikely to happen. Wait, is that date right? 417. Yeah, that's right. 417. Yeah, that's right. 417. And then 419 is the Wednesday. And then we'll review for the final exam on that last day. So what you want to do is sort of bring your comments, bring your questions, bring your requests for me to do things, explain things to either of those sessions, actually. And however you like to do that. Even if you can't make it into campus, which is fine because the majority do not, feel free to participate in the Zoom call. It sort of occurred to me, I don't know if I had mentioned in this class or not, but it sort of occurred to me that I think sometimes people may feel a little bit inhibited when they're attending the Zoom call. Maybe they feel like they should just not participate because they're not expected to, but you're free to. I mean, we're a small enough group, even if everyone were here and physically in the classroom, we're small enough that you could do that. So don't feel inhibited at all. I really do want your participation. I really do. And I think it's important. And But, I don't generally draw people out. So it's up to you to, to ask me and whatnot. And if you feel more comfortable, as some do, to deal with things on a one-on-one basis, feel free to contact me. I'm pretty much here every day, so that should be no issue there. So, all right, so that's where we are, and this is where we're going. It's almost hard to believe that it's almost April, or it is April. It's almost April. It is April, and so we are going to cover the next couple of weeks, just a couple more chapters. One dealing with information failures primarily. So chapter 6. Remember, we're skipping chapter 15. Maybe I should write that up here so you have that. We're going to skip chapter 15, and we're just not going to cover it. We just don't really have time. I looked it over and I thought, yeah, it's a good chapter. We've got materials that are interesting, but I think it's going to take away from some of what I really wanted to get at, which is some of this. And I think most business schools that would accept people from taking a micro course would want people to know about information failures. So remember, this idea of information failure sort of flows from the general idea, the general notion of this topic in economics called market failure. I'm trying to get a camera set right here. Okay, there we go. So it goes to what's called market failure. Now remember, we have to go back a few weeks here to discuss what the definition of market failure was. It was a pretty comprehensive definition, and I said at the time that what market failure is not some sort of broad scale indictment of any economic actor in particular, or any one group of actors in particular, or the idea that economics itself is prone to wrong-headedness or whatever. It's instead a sort of recognition that if you let private actors simply try to work things out on their own, they oftentimes can't or won't do it, and sometimes there's no economic incentive to do so. And the first of the market failure examples we talked about were in chapters 12 and 13, and they deal with externalities, which is probably the most prominent of all of the topics dealing with market failure is externalities, because there's really no way for economic actors to individually, on their own, from a private standpoint, deal with them. And then we talked about things like public goods, and we talked about why public goods exist. For instance, there would be no private incentive to create highways, for instance. I mean, it just wouldn't really exist. And by the way, it's not like this hasn't been tried before. I saw a really interesting documentary about something called the Lincoln Highway, which was built before Route 66 connected LA to Chicago, and which of course we're all familiar in this part of the country with Route 66. But it was a major undertaking. But there was a private effort before that. And I mean private. It was people getting together, and sometimes it might have involved state governments, local governments, and they said, look, let's build a transcontinental highway across the country so we can move goods, we can move people, link the country up, tie the country together, be a modern place. They tried it, but the problem was that you'd start out and one road would be built by some group of people, and then you'd have another group starting this direction. They wouldn't meet, and then they'd have to kind of link back up. And sometimes the surface pavement would be really, really poor, and there'd be twists and turns. It wouldn't be signs anywhere telling people where they were going, what direction. It was just really a nightmare, and it's a nightmare that existed because you just can't coordinate the activities of private actors to do things. Part of the effort behind involving government in terms of providing these public goods, okay, and we're going to talk about the government involvement once again when we talk about insurance, because there are insurance products that deal with one market failure, and that's just simply the idea that we face risks and perils in our lives. And as a result, private actors can't really help us with these kinds of things. And I think this is something that's a very mature view, really, of how life is, that private actors are unable or unwilling sometimes to be able to help others with the issues that they've got. So we need government as this sort of safety net. So anyway, let's go. I want to just back up a little bit, because I know maybe I should have just, in hindsight, maybe I should have just waited until today to have begun this, but I got into this a little bit on Monday, and I want to talk about information failures. So information failures are basically one element, one component of what we call market failure in general, and they really relate to the fact that information breaks down. Now, why is this an important thing to talk about in general? I think we all know that information is not perfectly shared and whatnot, but it really is an effort, frankly. I think there's an appreciation that needs to be had here as to this effort to differentiate modern economic thinking with what was called classical economic thought. That was when, at the very beginning, economic theorists made some assumptions about how actors behave. One of those assumptions was that everybody had perfect information. Well, that's not a very good assumption in today's world, is it? I mean, but if you think about it, if you go back to the 1700s and 1800s, which is when these first economic authors started writing, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, what were the goods that we were talking about? Things like agricultural products and food and clothing and maybe farm implements. I mean, these are pretty easy goods to examine if you know what you're looking at, and there's nothing that's really complicated. Today, what are the goods to buy? Your doctor says, you've got some ailment, you need to take this medication. And what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to argue with your doctor? It's probably a good idea to do research on your own, but sometimes that's inadequate if you don't have the background and training to do it. The products are very complicated. I was telling a class the other day that I get a pension statement in the mail periodically, about once a year, from the state of New Mexico, telling me what my retirement benefit will be if I work to this age and all this, and if I live and if I die, my wife lives, and what her benefit will be and all that. And it's very, very complicated. And I mean, I studied this stuff for a lot of years, but I didn't study actuarial accounting. So that's an area that I have really got to look at. I'm thinking, my gosh, if I don't understand this, I mean, how is the average person who works for the state of New Mexico supposed to understand these statements? The economic transactions we're involved in are much, much, much more complicated. So as a result, information failures and the breakdown of information really has an impact on the efficiency of markets. Remember, if we go back once again to these early classical thinkers, Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and all of these, they had this idea that everyone had perfect information. Yes, they might make mistakes. You might overpay for a horse or whatever, but you learn your lesson, you get better and better and better all the time. And so everybody tends to become better, and as a result, markets work efficiently. Okay, that I think was the basis for a lot of economics up really until around the Great Depression, when there was a lot of questioning as to whether or not we even had the right idea about how markets should even operate in the first place, and how human behavior is said to operate. And as a result, we had countries going in all kinds of different directions during the Great Depression. You had dictatorships being formed in Europe. In this country, you had this push-pull between those who wanted dictatorship and those who wanted to go very far to the left. And so as a result, a lot of this was over economic tensions and the inability to really get a grip on what was happening economically. And so today, I think where we are is recognizing that there are failures and breakdowns of information, and they lead to some of the causes of economic inefficiency. So I don't think most economists today would say that markets are always efficient. I think that they would say, look, when they work well, they are pretty efficient. That is, buyers and sellers usually arrive at a good price, and they distribute output relatively efficiently, and you've got incentives for everyone to behave in their own best interests, and there are laws that protect them from acting outside of their best interests to the disadvantage of somebody else. And so for the most part, it tends to work. But don't be saying that everything is perfect, hunky-dory all the time, because there are these issues. So the first of these is imperfect information. And imperfect information is simply, it's incomplete, that people don't have enough information to make a good decision. And this can be, by the way, on both the demand side and the supply side of any economic transaction, both sides. And it can also be coupled, frankly, with the second kind, which is the more interesting topic we're going to talk about. It's asymmetric information. There's no contradiction between somebody having imperfect but also asymmetric information. In fact, I would dare say it's probably very common in both cases. When we talk about asymmetric information, this really began to pick up steam really in the 1960s. And if you want to go back even to the 1930s, this idea of markets not working efficiently. And so what do we do and why? But during the 60s and 70s, Joe Stiglitz, George Akerlof in particular, were some of the big theorists. Stiglitz actually won the Nobel Prize for his work on asymmetric information. But it was the idea that in asymmetric information, the recognition is that parties typically have different amounts of information and they're unequal. And it's usually the fact that one person has, or one party, I should say, it's not even a person, one party of the transaction has more information than someone else. And so as a result, there is a lot of uncertainty and mistakes are made. About some cases, and I can recall my dad would always love to buy new cars. He would always buy a car like every couple of years or so, and I'm just the opposite. I'd rather drive a car until the wheels fall off, but he loved to buy cars. But he always thought that he was a very bad bargainer. It always felt like they were laughing at him back in the dealership as he drove off the lot. And I think it's because he thought, look, I don't know enough to bargain for a car. And in fact, I think that, and I've said this before in class, I think that Americans probably don't really have enough, we haven't flexed our bargaining muscles enough because we really don't have too many markets in which there's much bargaining going on. I mean, I've talked about the scenario where you're going to walk in this ridiculous scenario. I mean, we all know it's ridiculous, walking into Walgreens or Albertsons and arguing over the price of, a hairbrush or whatever, and trying to bargain and trying to get them down and moving on. Okay, what's the price of aspirin? It's just not going to happen. We don't have that. Well, obviously a bigger ticket item, the stakes are bigger, but then there's also, this is where the magnification comes from the loss that could be incurred by somebody who has less information than the other. So this is an important thing. And so the causes really here are two main causes. And the first of these we should mention is obviously the most damning, and that's this idea of willful concealment or deception. I've got something I'm selling you. I'm not going to tell you this. It's up to you to come out. And if you figure it out, it's like, oh, well, I didn't know that either. Right? That sort of thing. Obviously, there are problems with this. There are sometimes laws that deal with this particular issue. By the way, Akerlof, a very famous paper, and it's famous to economists, in 1970 called The Market for Lemons. And it really became the basis for much of this discussion of asymmetric information. And when he talked about the fact that there were lots of inefficiencies in markets where somebody knows the product they're selling is not up to snuff. They're misrepresenting what their product is. And so as a result, there's deception going on. And as a result, if somebody knew, if a buyer knew what the seller knew, the terms of the transaction will be different or there would be no sale. And that's really an effort at willful concealment or deception. The idea that one party knows something the other doesn't. We all kind of know this. We know what's going on here. And I've got a product. I want to sell you my used car. Oh, it's $500 for a Corvette. Well, why so little? What's wrong with it? That's that sort of thing, right? And so I think we all sort of know that there is that tendency on the part of some to engage in willful concealment or just outright deception. Now, there are definitely laws against this, but honestly, in a lot of states, these so-called lemon laws are relatively new. I think probably only 20 or 30 years in which private actors, that is, like I have a used car, I'm going to sell you, I'm just a person, and I want to sell a used car, that I could be held liable for anything that I knew about the car that I didn't tell you about. Obviously, business law has addressed the issue of fraud and deception for a very long time. And sometimes states do a better job enforcing it than other states do. I've lived in a couple of states that didn't do a very good job of enforcing the law against that. But this effort to go after private individuals for misconstruing a product is relatively new. A lot of it influenced by this idea of lemons, and so lemon laws have come around. This is obviously the most dramatic and the one that most people are concerned about is this idea of I'm being cheated. You knew this about the car, you knew this about the house, whatever. This product is there, and as a result, I've been hoodwinked and I've been just taken advantage of. We all know that. But the second one is probably even more serious because there's no intent at all. And in fact, it's one of those things I mentioned on the first day of class. You don't know what you don't know, and that's inadvertent omission or concealment, and that's where there are errors that are made or omissions in something that just simply wasn't disclosed, wasn't thought about. Maybe nobody even considered it. And sometimes people just don't know what it is that they're actually trying to sell somebody. And sometimes there are things that's like, well, I didn't know that either. And so it's inadvertent. And so there's a mistake there, but it's asymmetric. So remember, both parties can suffer both asymmetric and imperfect information at the same time. And I'll just give you an example here of how this can happen. My very first job out of college was in banking. I worked in retail banking. In those days, we made lots of variable rate loans. And people liked the variable rate loans because rates at that time were coming down. And so everyone wanted, if it was a car loan or a home equity loan or whatever, they all wanted variable rate loans because they were down. And the rates were falling. If the rates were going up, they had fixed rates, which is human nature, obviously. So we would just tell customers, and the customers would say, okay, it's tied to the prime rate. It'll go up with the prime rate, it'll go down with the prime rate. Yes, okay. So I remember rates eventually began to go up a little bit. And there was a longtime employee who we had picked up we had taken over a bank, and she'd been there for years and years and years, and really, yes, but rates went up, and then they began to fall again. So we had a borrower's rate go up, and they come to back down, but then level off at 10%. So let's say you had a rate of prime plus 3, the rate might have started out at 12%, or maybe it started out at at 9%, then it went to 11, then it went to 12, then it came to 10, it leveled off at 10. It wouldn't fall, and the rates kept falling in general, and his rate wouldn't fall. And he finally looked into it and said, why is my rate not falling? And so she said, I don't know, and looked into it and was told that apparently there was a clause in the contract that said the rate can go above 10% on the upside, but it can't fall below 10% if it goes above it, and it doesn't fall below 10. It's like, what? It's like nobody had ever heard of such an agreement. It was in our contract. And she said, well, it never came up before because we used to do mostly fixed rate loans. This was an era in which rates were coming down. So people were now looking at variable rate loans. It just never really occurred to her to even ask about it. Nobody knew anything about it. None of us knew about it whatsoever. But that was a case in which we were trying to represent something about something that we didn't know it was there because nobody thought it would be there. And remember, the first day of class, we said, we don't know what we don't know. And so as a result, that person probably would not have chosen that product had he known the particular risk that he would have gotten into. But it was a very bad situation, and it really soured the business relationship. And that's a different one. And one other example here, just because I think it's so revealing, is the fact that we, for years and years, had a particular agreement when I moved into commercial lending that people would sign as a personal guarantee on loans. And it turns out that we found out the hard way that there was something that was illegal, not hugely illegal, but there was a clause in there that was illegal. It was a binding part of the contract it was illegal in that state. We just didn't know it. And we found out because a lawyer somewhere had found it. And when it went to court, the judge said, okay, you can't enforce that. We had to revise all our contracts. And we had thousands of borrowers out there running around with that illegal provision in there. And then, of course, we did our best to make everyone aware of that. But then again, we didn't know that it was an issue. So we don't know what we don't know. So what are the results of asymmetric information, whether it's willful, whether it's inadvertent? Inequitable distribution of outcomes. And that's really what's going on here. Somebody gains and somebody loses as a result of these particular sorts of issues. Now, by the way, I think that there's a tendency to think, and I certainly have given you no reason, that this is mostly a supply side problem of imposing burdens and costs and losses on the demand side. And that's true. However, it goes both directions. And one of those directions is something called adverse selection. This is a particularly important issue when it comes to insurance. And that's the idea that sometimes buyers are liars. And we see this with insurance all the time. Somebody wants to buy life insurance. Okay, so what is it life insurance companies want to know about you? Or what would they prefer that you be if you're buying life insurance? Healthy, and that you don't smoke, and that you're not a rock climber, you don't go underwater cave diving or skydiving or all these kinds of things. I mean, I think when I bought life insurance years ago, I think there was a provision I couldn't go skydiving. Not that I had any desire to do skydiving, but it was actually written in that contract. And they asked a bunch of questions like, did I do these kinds of things? Did I do rock climbing? No. There were all these kinds of questions. And smoking is a big one. And a lot of times people say, no, I don't smoke. Right? When in fact, maybe they do smoke. And that's a big one. And we all right now that smoking is dangerous. I don't think anybody knows that smoking is. I mean, how many people do you know who think smoking is actually perfectly safe? I mean, I don't think there are too many. If they are, they're definitely an outlier. But everyone knows smoking is dangerous, but people oftentimes lie about it and say they don't smoke. And as a result, if they're accepted into the same risk pool, and we'll talk about risk pools in a minute, then obviously the product is being mispriced relative to what the information that was being shared when it's suggested. So as a result, sometimes the demand side can be hoodwinking the supply side, which is why the supply side, when it comes to insurance, they go to great lengths to try to discover whether or not you're a smoker or not. And they will oftentimes pull, well, when it comes to life insurance, they'll pull what's called a medical information bureau, which a lot of people didn't even know exists, but it's basically your health record. And it will tell them if you've been hospitalized or treated for lung issues and whatnot, like emphysema and whatnot. It's usually a giveaway for smoking. COPD is almost a dead giveaway for smoking. And so as a result, they might not believe your story. They might say, well, it doesn't matter anyway because you've got COPD. So therefore, either we'll insure you at this price or we're not going to insure you at all. And by the way, as I'll mention when we talk about private insurance in a minute, this is one product in which sellers sometimes walk away from the sale and say, we don't want your business. And it's only really in the financial industry that I can think of where it's routine for one actor to say, we don't want to do business with you. And even though it may be profitable, we don't want to. Same goes on in banking and whatnot, but I can't think of too many other areas outside of finance, financial services where that happens. But adverse selection is simply mispricing the product by including somebody in a particular risk pool because you've selected them wrongly. And insurance companies will go to great lengths, and if it's any amount of size of a life insurance policy at all, they will probably draw your blood. And they did that to me the last time I bought life insurance. They sent a nurse over and she drew my blood, okay? And just to make sure that I'm not a smoker and that I don't know what they tested for, but I don't smoke and whatnot. And so I, probably picked up a lot of caffeine in my blood, but that's clearly okay. But you get the idea that they want to sort of verify. And that's one of the means to deal with, among all the means that we're going to talk about to deal with asymmetric information, is that also there are increased risk by parties that have less information. So the less information you have, the more risk that goes on. There are oftentimes cases in which you take risk on that you would not have taken risk on if you had more information about what you were doing. Well, we all sort of know this, because we all, even in our own lives, know that in hindsight, I would have done this. Had I known what I know now, I would have done that. And the same goes in an economic setting. Had we known this, we would not have done this. I can think back to my time in banking. We probably would not have been involved in subprime lending, even though it was a very tiny part of our business. Had we known that those products were so lethal, and that the investors who bought them, didn't particularly care. They were misrepresenting what was going on to their investors, and so you get the idea. Had they had better information. So the key is, what do we do about information problems? And here's the dilemma. This is the dilemma facing economists and really everybody who has to deal with information. And that is, these issues are probably not getting better, if anything, they're getting worse. Simply because of the fact that the world is becoming more complicated, more integrated, more global. And so as a result, we've got threats coming from places we've never thought of before. Just take cybersecurity as one particular issue, and which, by the way, when we talk about threats in insurance terms, we call these perils. Perils are anything that could cause a loss, okay? Whether it's a banana peel on the floor of a grocery store, whether it's a potential hacker trying to get into your database, hacking into your servers and whatnot, those are all perils. And these are things that weren't thought of years ago. Was this idea that somebody could break into your systems and impose spyware or malware or ransomware and thereby incur a loss. And by the way, I think that we hear about these ransomware issues occasionally. And I think there was a hospital somewhere, I think it was in Mexico, that had ransomware implanted on their servers. And I think they ended up paying, it was like $1 million or something. I forget where it was. Somewhere nearby. And it was not a big story, and I heard about it sort of through the grapevine, because it's not good for, I guess, good for business or good for whatever, good for public relations to know that people can get away with doing that. But it does happen. And the most recent one that I can think of was the payroll firm Kronos, which a lot of public employees are on. It's just basically, it's a cloud-based payroll system. You clock in, clock out, log your hours, managers do things with payroll and all that, and somebody imposed ransomware on that. And I think Kronos eventually, I don't know that they paid it, although I am not sure what happened. And I know a little bit about this because my sister-in-law worked for the county at the time, and she said it was a big deal. They had to go to paper documents and whatnot. And I think the company reintroduced a new system to replace that, and hopefully it's a little bit more secure. But these are perils that never were really thought about before the internet age. And sometimes they can come from overseas. And by the way, we have very little ability to enforce the law, particularly in places where the United States is not particularly friendly, or is thought to be a friendly state, i.e. Russia, i.e. China, North Korea. North Korea has supposedly got entire campuses full of people who are being trained to hack into systems and steal money and do all these kinds of things. These are perils that really never existed before. And the problem is getting worse, not better. And I think that this is going to be one of the big areas. Cybersecurity is going to be one of the big employment areas going forward. No question about it. And all firms have got to be concerned about it. And everybody's got to be concerned about it. I know that we bought LifeLock, and LifeLock is now, I think, owned by Norton. So we're trying to do our best just in my house to try to beef up our situation. So, all right, we talked a little bit about risk, but let's talk about this idea of what risk is, because when people hear risk, I think they have the idea of bad things and scary things and whatnot. And they could include that, but we have a more concrete definition, a more specific definition in econ, we say the risk is the degree of uncertainty of outcomes. And I'll post these PowerPoints a bit later. I just wanted to, I was trying to do some sort of moving these slides around and whatnot, because this is the first time I've covered this chapter, this particular text, but I won't post these, you'll have these. So risk is the degree of uncertainty of an outcome. And it could be a good outcome or a bad outcome, frankly. That's what risk is. Risk is how certain we are of what the outcome is going to be. Outcomes which are very certain are considered riskless. So that is, if I buy a 3-month treasury bill that yields 4.2%, I know I'm going to be paid 4.2% in 3 months, because there's practically no chance the U.S. government's not going to honor that. And the reason the U.S. government is probably going to honor it is because there's probably very little chance that the U.S. government's going to go out of business. And even if they, even if something calamitous happened, they could simply print more money. And that would be one way that they could honor their obligations. That's pretty riskless. Or if I set my alarm for 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm assuming that the sun's going to come up, tomorrow is going to happen. I don't really think about, well, is tomorrow actually going to get here? It's a pretty riskless activity. But if there's a high uncertainty, then there are some issues where there's a high certainty of outcomes that sometimes are not risky. High certainty of outcomes are not risky. But we have events that have low certainty of outcomes. Those are risky. Those are risky. But we don't really know what's happening. Okay, and so when we're talking about what the outcomes are, we're talking about this idea of we just simply don't know what's going to happen. And it can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. So sometimes, and this works in the business world, where businesses have a particular product that they want to launch, and they really don't know what the outcome is going to be. And it could be a blockbuster or it could be a dud, and it happens. And sometimes you just don't know. And the business world continues to amaze itself, because sometimes the weirdest products are just the most popular, and some of the ones that look like a blockbuster are just fall flat on their face. We really don't know. We see this in the entertainment industry all the time, where a particular entertainer is just a blockbuster hit, but they were turned down and turned down and turned down by previous record labels or movie producers or whatnot. And nobody knew what they didn't know. And so sometimes these outcomes just simply, whether we know or we don't know is sort of up in the air. So when we talk about risk and the idea of risk acceptance, then this leads us to this, what we simply refer to as risk tolerance. Risk tolerance. And this is something that is probably better described by psychologists than by economists in some ways, I think. Although I mentioned before that there is a discipline that is in economics, it's called behavioral economics, that's sort of the intersection of economics and psychology. And Richard names at the University of Chicago won the Nobel Prize for a lot of his work in behavioral economics. It's an important area. It's trying to understand why people do what they do. And sometimes it's because people exhibit different characteristics and have different willingness to do things. And it goes against really some of these sort of time, and maybe overly time-worn description, things like age and race and gender and whatnot. This is the fact that there are sometimes people who are willing to take risks that others are not willing to take. And so we talk about risk seekers versus risk averters. And we know that we've got different, and this is not, they're not two groups where everyone's sorted in one group or the other. It is a continuum where you've got people very far on the extreme of risk seeking and very far on the other of risk averting. And my sister is probably pretty far on the extreme of risk averter. She will go to great lengths. She always drives the right lane of the interstate. She doesn't want to go past anybody. And when she goes on a long trip, she'll if it's a 10-hour trip, she'll stop halfway, spend the night. She doesn't want to get tired. She's extreme in that regard, right? There are other people that don't make plans and just say, let's just see what happens, right? Let's just jump into it. Let's just grab a bag and jump on a plane and go to Hawaii, right? Or whatever, that sort of thing. And so there are people who are willing to accept unknowns a lot more than other people are. We call those risk seekers. And it's a continuum. So what about risk seeking? First of all, it's the desire on the part of some actor to seek out risky activities. Okay. All right. Now this is what's going on here. So why do some people do that? And they don't know what the outcome is going to be. It's because they associate risky activities with being able to gain from that activity. Hey, this will be fun. Let's do it. Let's do this. Let's make this decision. Let's get crazy. Let's do that, right? Because it's going to be something that's going to be good. On the other hand, risk averters are those who look at the riskiness of activity and associate it with loss. I don't want to do that. Are you crazy? Why would I want to do that, right? And I think all of us understand that there are people who've got different amounts of risk acceptance and risk tolerance. And by the way, there's been a lot of research about how when it comes to individuals, some of this changes over time because we become risk seekers when we're younger, and we become much more risk averse as we get older. And certainly the investment world has known this for a very long time, knowing that people take on very risky investments when they're young and then start moving to things like bonds and certificates of deposit and government bonds as they get older, because they have less time to live and can't recover the loss. I mean, if you're 80 years old, you can't go out and get another job to replace the income you might have lost in the investment world. I mean, you could, but it's probably less likely than if you're 30 years old, right? So you get the idea that there's a risk, sort of an age factor here. But independent of the age issue, we know there are people who are willing to take risks. I mean, you probably have known people who will go to an amusement park and go on any ride, just jump on any ride at all, right? And others who wouldn't get on a ride for their lives. If their life depended upon it, if you gave them $1 million, they wouldn't get on the ride. Just like if you go to cliffs, that ride that goes up in the air and has swings, and you're 200 feet up in the air, whatever it is, I bet you couldn't give some people $1 million. They probably still wouldn't go on that ride. Others, they would pay you to go on that ride. And they do pay you to go on that ride. So you get the idea, but it's usually younger people who have or associating the risk with gain. So what does this mean economically? I mean, it's a trivial example, riding on vines and cliffs and whatnot, but when it comes to, these are mostly trivial. What is if I had to ask you, where are most people on this continuum? Because I said that, okay, they're not two groups, risk averters over here, risk seekers over here. Instead, there's a continuum, and so we're sort of sorted out. But there is an imbalance of the sorting, and where does that imbalance lie? It lies here, where there are many more people who are risk averse. And I think that there are a lot of explanations for this. Thaler has talked about this idea of risk aversion as being biological, and that economists really need to rely more upon behavioral science, particularly even psychiatry, to wonder why people are more risk averse, and it may be biological. Animals are pretty cautious. If you see a cat you've never met before, the cat will be very cautious, and before they come up to allow you to pet it and whatnot. And so it may be just a biological instinct to be very, very cautious. Or there are people who are very uncomfortable around strangers, and so that could be a biological sort of thing where people are very risk averse, don't really want to meet new people and whatnot. So I think most people fall into that category. But there are those who are risk seekers, and this is independent of any other demographic, including age in this case, by taking risks. And in economics, where are we looking at here? This is really associated with entrepreneurial ability. So remember, when we talked about the factors of production, it's been several weeks ago, we said, okay, we can take all these inputs that go into making goods, run them through the hopper, and we have these outputs. But among these inputs are one great category called entrepreneurial ability, which was something that probably didn't used to be, well, it didn't used to be there when land, labor, and capital were the first three. But it was this idea that there's some X factor that somebody somewhere is bringing to the input-output combination. That is something that we need to account for. And that's the idea of risk seeking. And that entrepreneurial ability is really the ability to and willingness to accept risk. About risk seekers, think about, and I know when we think about entrepreneurs, you think about individuals like Bill Gates and Henry Ford and whatnot. But just take those examples and look at the risks that they did take. Bill Gates leaves Harvard, arguably the best university in the country, saying to his parents, I can't learn anything more from them. It's a pretty gutsy statement. So he moves here to Albuquerque to start a software company in an industry that really didn't exist. And then because his mother knew the chairman of IBM, represented to IBM, they had a product that he didn't even have, and said, I've got an operating system that I can sell you. He didn't even own the operating system. He went out and bought it from somebody and then made it into MS-DOS. And then said, okay, I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm going to license it to you. That's how Microsoft began. That's how the whole software business really began in terms of licensing software. You really don't own software. You own the license and the right to use it. That really started. That's a pretty risky activity, right? Most people wouldn't want to do that, okay? Another example I can think of that really comes to mind, and because I know that we're often tempted to think about individuals here, but Arthur Stewart comes to mind as being a great example. And I know that she's sort of been out of the limelight for the last few years. And I know that as more time goes by, fewer people are familiar with who she is, but she was sort of a style maven and home decor and home cooking sort of person. She left a job on Wall Street and to go start a catering company. That's how her whole thing started. And then it turned into things like cookbooks and TV shows and all this. And she became fabulously wealthy, had her own cable channel and that. And then she got caught up in an insider trading situation where she traded on inside information on a stock. And it turns out the government wanted to charge her with that. And it turns out she actually went to prison. And sometimes people say to me, yes, Martha Stewart went to prison. And I sometimes say, that's a perfect example because risk sometimes does not mean gain. Sometimes risk does mean loss. And the riskiness of the activity means the greater variability of the outcome. So she really had no defense. She used to work in a securities firm on Wall Street. She knew you could not trade on material, non-public information. But that's an example of how riskiness happens. People willing to do things that others are not willing to do. And she fully knew the consequences. Now, she actually went to prison for lying to the FBI. That was the charge, which at the time I didn't even know that was a crime to lie to the FBI, but I guess it is. So but that's the example of that. Now, a more relevant example probably in microeconomics is business firms that engage in risky activities. And I think that is really one that where there's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I know, particularly in marketing, marketers have been encouraged for years now to think of products that nobody's ever thought of before because they can be the next blockbuster product. One of the reasons why Steve Jobs was successful is thought to be the fact that he always made Apple into some different kind of company. He never wanted to go along with the Microsoft platform, wanted to have his own particular model and his own particular deal. Now, remember, he lost control of Apple. He was kicked out of his own firm, back in 84, 85, something like that, made his way back and then made more money selling non-computer products than the actual computers and software they started with. So a lot of businesses were learning to say, look, we can become fabulously wealthy, we can make lots and lots of money if we just simply take more risks and get outside the box a little bit. Yes? Okay, so questions about risk tolerance and this idea that there is and by the way, your text, it's quite interesting because this chapter of the book, it talks about risk, but it doesn't really get into these topics that much of risk tolerance and risk aversion. And it's a little bit curious to me because usually when we cover risk tolerance in micro, we get into these issues of risk aversion, risk seeking. And for whatever reason, your authors really didn't get into that. So this is why I'm spending so much time going over because there's really nothing in the book to read about that as much as what we're talking about here. So let's talk about what is the most common set of behaviors for most economic actors. That's risk aversion, okay? And again, as I mentioned a minute ago, it is thought. I don't know that it's established fact at this point, but sometimes it's unsettling when college professors tell people that we don't really know everything. This is what we think we know right now. It's unsettling, but it is thought to have a biological basis, and that is why people are cautious. It's because it's human nature to be cautious. It's just that some people are more cautious than others. So it's an increasing awareness over time of the severity of possible losses. This is where that age issue comes in. Also, as you're increasing older, there's less time available to recover from potential losses. This particularly applies to economic and financial losses, where you simply don't have the opportunity to recover. If I do this, I may never get my money back ever again because I'll never have that opportunity to do it. So I'm therefore going to be very risk averse. A great example of this was in the Dallas Cowboys quarterback, Dak Prescott, who signed a contract. And people were saying maybe he should have held on a little bit more, made a little bit more money, even though it was a fabulous amount of money. And then I think that year that he signed the contract, he actually broke his leg and was out for most of the season. But it was a guaranteed contract. And so as a result, he was well aware, and football players of all people ought to be well aware, sometimes you may never be able to recover from losses. And so this may be your only opportunity to be able to earn these kinds of returns in doing what it is you do. And a function of age. And they've got very short careers, football players do. That's why it's, to my mind, it's kind of a hard sport to follow from a people standpoint, because the players are always changing so much that not everyone's like a Tom Brady. Okay, so one, this is a time issue. The other is simply development of routines. And this is interesting because I know that routines are meant to lower the possibility of some bad outcome, Now, I grew up in a household. My dad was a career Army officer, 20 years in the Army. And one of the things that drilled into people, even in officers, is develop routines, do routines the very same way, and do everything the same way. Make your bed every day, do these kind of things. In the Army, too, they say put coins in your left pocket. That was drilled into me. All my coins are still in my left pocket today, just because my dad said, "Where's your buddy?" And of course, when you're growing up in the Army officer, this is the kind of thing. I have my coins in my left pocket, even though I never served a day in the service. I was never in the Army, but you get the idea of because you know where things are, where things are going to be, so you do things the very same way. We might know people who are so risk averse that they know exactly where everything is in their house, on their desk. If they're out sick for a couple of days, somebody sits at their desk, their world is upside down because things have been moved around and whatnot. And it's very unsettling. It creates uncertainty. So as a result, most people are risk averse of that. And also there's a general flattening of utility for most activities. That is, the more we do certain things, we get diminishing marginal utility. We've talked about this before. And that is the idea that as we do things, we get less and less benefit from doing them. So as a result, we don't want to take on new things because we kind of think, well, yes, it might be good for now, but it's going to be not so good in the future. So why do I want to try this new thing, right? And then maybe that's a pessimistic view. I don't know. But also, there's a better ability over time to manage the risks that remain. And this is really where a lot of your chapter gets into. And that is, as time goes by, we get better at managing this idea of risk. And I wish we had time to get into more of this idea of risk management. And when I've talked to people out in the business world, I've got my own firm, and so I do talk to people who are involved in what's called risk management. And risk management, particularly for bigger companies, is really an entire set of activities that we really don't talk about very much in undergraduate business classes. But if you work for any firm of any size, we will probably have maybe even an entire department that deals with risk management, where they're trying to identify things which can cause uncertainty and potential loss, primarily about loss. And as they identify those, they get better and better over time. And this includes things like making people aware of safety precautions at work. 3M, the company that makes Post-its and a lot of other stuff, tape and all that for years, their internal slogan was one word: safety. And they felt they could save tremendous amounts of money by having zero injuries at work, because injuries at work are very costly. Certainly they're costly to the individual who gets hurt. But that's the idea of trying to simply emphasize this idea of trying to bring down the possibility of bad outcomes. And that's what the entire category of risk management really is. And it's not just insurance, although insurance companies have sort of gotten involved in this idea of risk management, and they're natural actors to be able to do that. So what are some of the solutions to asymmetric information? Okay, I'm losing my voice, or I apologize. I've had a lot of classes this week, and so more than usual, because we've got some night classes going on right now. So bear with me a little bit. So what are some of the solutions to these information asymmetries? Well, first of all, most of these are really legal responses, and then we get into more private issues, disclosure and transparency requirements. So really the 1970s in this country was really the heyday of the introduction of all these requirements of things like of disclosing what ingredients were in particular goods that we would consume. Disclosures for things like insurance and credit and home ownership. Homeowners' warranties were sort of developed. Truth in packaging and truth in labeling laws were really very big at one time. In fact, even sort of what is interesting is when there was a Food and Drug Administration administrator named David Kessler, who was really, really vigilant about this idea of truth in labeling. And he would go after like Minute Maid for saying the orange juice was fresh frozen. He would say there's no such thing as fresh frozen. It's either fresh or it's frozen. So making them change that, even though most people probably didn't catch that. So it's probably frozen, and I think, and maybe even Minute Maid to be, deceptive. And they're probably thinking, look, it was fresh when it was frozen. That's what we mean. It was fresh when it was frozen. But he's saying, no, that's not the way it is presented. So he didn't change that. And was very vigilant about that. And this is where also, even things like snacks, which used to be, you can just buy a candy bar. It was just a candy bar. It was just a wrapper. But now you've got all kinds of nutritional information in that. It tells, how many calories and how much fat, how much sodium, all that they go into it. This all stems from this idea of truth in labeling and truth in packaging. How much this thing weighs, how much sugar is in it, And there are people who are allergic to things like peanuts and other products. And so it helps them to know to avoid difficulties with that. Also, plain English contract language really began in the 1970s in Spanish, because particularly in this country, we have a lot of Spanish speakers. And what does this mean, plain English? Well, it's an effort to really make contracts easily readable by the average person. And that means getting rid of all these Latin terms that lawyers are famous for throwing out all the time. And if you ever known any lawyers, they'll always say there's no mens rea, or there's a habeas issue or whatever, right? And so these are not terms that we use in everyday speech. Lawyers do, but everyday people do not. So as a result, making contracts without these extraneous terms or without complicated terms that make it understandable to all. Now, this is an effort that's imperfect because we're not quite there yet. There are still some contracts that are very difficult to understand, and sometimes you really do need a lawyer to sort of piece these things apart. And frankly, if you're getting anything very, very complicated at all, you really do need lawyers to get involved in looking through some of these things. And I know that I'm involved with a family trust of farm property, and so it becomes difficult because there are a lot of us who are involved in the trust, and we really need lawyers to sort of sort out what these complexities are, and even not just in contract language, but in general, understanding what the law is, because I have no background in the law, and so I can't really speak to that. And then plain Spanish, I think, is very interesting as well, and maybe different in various populations that begin to have prominence in America. Maybe we'll introduce other languages as well. But in terms of a social movement to introduce, plain language within contracts, so that people can read it and understand what's going on. Also, contracts of adhesion. So what is a contract of adhesion? This is a legal doctrine, I guess you could say, that says, look, if there's a contract that's written by one party to the transaction, which is very common, right? You go to buy a car. I mean, last time we bought a car, my wife and I, it was like, we signed probably 20 or 30 documents, it seems like, and it was a lot. And by the way, if you ever buy a house, you'll sign more documents than that, and they just keep sliding documents to you. Here, sign this, here, sign this, here, sign this. And if you took the time to read it, they probably will look at you like you're a lunatic, but you're not really. You just want to know what it is you're signing. What are you putting your name on? This is a flood certificate, sign this. This is a survey document, sign, you say that you saw this, and you understand this, acknowledge this, and it really is an issue. And so as a result, if there are errors or if there is some problem, that the liability goes to whoever created the contract. That's, in other words, the loss adheres to whoever wrote the contract, because the other side is just simply signing. And this is really an area that I mean, frankly, I think most of us are guilty, and I will put myself in that category of guilty. That is, we sign a lot of stuff, we don't know what the heck we're signing. It's a problem. It's a real problem, particularly when somebody comes up down the road. And the answer on the other side of the transaction is, well, you signed it. Is that your signature? That's it. And that oftentimes is sufficient in court. I mean, I know when I'm just aware, and I haven't been involved personally in very much litigation, just in business, in the corporate world, but I know there have been times in which people have tried to get out contracts that my firm was involved in, and the lawyer would put the person on the stand and say, is this your signature? Yes, thank you. No further questions. That's it. And that is all that needs to be emphasized, is the fact that somebody signed it, whether they understood it or whatever is not the issue. So it's difficult. And so as a result, if there are errors, it goes against typically the party that wrote it. It's sort of a legal question. And I'm not qualified to speak as to whether or not certain states have more rights to consumers as opposed to others. I know a lot of this really applies to the federal level primarily. So, some states may differ in that. I can't speak to that. Also, government oversight. Now, this is one that we've been talking about intermittently throughout the class. That is government regulation, and regulation really takes two forms. One is government regulation of production, and then also what we call social regulation, which basically is not so much which I know sometimes people look at and they think, oh, you're trying to regulate society and what people do, but it's not really. It's more about labor. It's about working conditions, where governments tries to step in and try to regulate the conditions by which products are produced and transacted. And that is that we don't want to employ children at age 8 or whatever to make products and whatnot and do those kinds of things, because children don't know what they're getting into. Sometimes they're taken advantage of. For government oversight, government regulation, this is why we have the alphabet soup of agencies that exist in order to deal with them. And then we get into more of the private reactions to asymmetric information. And among those are risk management. And these programs are many. And if you're interested in risk management, maybe as even a future career choice, you may look into it. There's a lot of information on it. I think it's a growing area. Particularly important here, I think, is this issue of the internet. There are a lot of things out there we just don't understand if we're doing business internationally. One of the big ones is language issues, and we've got to find people who can speak certain languages around the world, and that we trust them to be giving us the straight story as to what they're hearing. If we're doing business in Saudi Arabia and none of us speak Arabic, that's a real problem, you know. And I mean, I remember hearing Ken Burns' documentary on the Vietnam War, which I know is a completely separate issue, but it sort of is telling. Is that when the U.S. involvement in Vietnam began, there wasn't a single person in the U.S. Embassy who even spoke Vietnamese. So how on earth are you going to try to do something as complicated as military involvement? And nobody really can really speak to the people who are there. It's shocking. And so as a result, one of the ways to bring down the risks and the uncertainty, remember, risk is uncertainty, is by being familiar with the places in which people are doing business and understand what the rules are. There are certain holidays that exist overseas in certain countries. You don't want to schedule a Zoom call for a time in which people are not going to be there. It'd be like another country saying, okay, we're going to have a Zoom call Christmas morning. It's like, you would think they're out of their mind. Well, we would be considered out of our minds the same way. And then finally, insurance is really the last category here. And so when we talk about insurance, but there are lots of different elements to it. And we're going to get to that here in a bit. If my voice holds out, I'm going to lose my voice here. I am. This is kind of difficult. So let me, I think what I'm going to do is, because I'm kind of losing my voice, I'm going to circle back to regulation a little bit later. I'm going to do that. But I want to talk about insurance, first of all. This probably goes in a little bit better order anyway. I probably should reorder these slides before I post them, which I will. But let's talk about private insurance first of all. So what does insurance seek to do? I think we all know we buy insurance to protect ourselves against loss. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Okay, but the characteristics I think are important for us to realize that when we buy insurance, there is a preference to take buyers and to drop them into buckets or pools. They simply call them pools. And so if we're trying to and insurance companies are more or less free, frankly, to take buyers into whatever kind of characteristics they want. I know that, and one of the things that the insurance industry has been able to do is to keep regulators mostly off their backs. And I say that because for the most part, insurance is regulated at the state level, okay, in this country. It has been for decades. The only real federal involvement here is mostly in things like health insurance. And believe me, the insurance companies fought tooth and nail to try to keep that at bay. And frankly, we're mostly successful even after the Affordable Care Act. But that and certain tax provisions having to do with life insurance and whatnot, some very technical things, but for the most part, it's a state managed thing. I can tell you when it comes to regulation, that state regulation is oftentimes associated with lesser amount of enforcement, oversight, and penalties for malefactors when it comes to that. I'll just give you an example when it comes to insurance, and because I think it's important for us to understand one of the consequences of engaging in behavior risks and burdens on the other side. We at one point got life insurance licenses because we were trying to sell annuities in banking, and we were told by our boss, I fell on my chair, that, okay, don't break the law. You know, unlike in banking, where if you lie to somebody or break the law, your career is basically done, and you probably are going to go to prison, depending on what you did. But she said to us, she goes, you know, the penalties for making a mistake here are not very common. Don't do it. But if you do, we're not very serious. So I think what she was trying to say to us is push the envelope. I think that's what she was trying to tell us. And so the point I want to make about insurance is that they are able to do a lot of things that probably others are not. such as sort people into risk pools, that probably would not be acceptable in other sorts of markets, frankly. I mean, you probably couldn't sort smokers and non-smokers at Smith's and say, smokers go over here, non-smokers go over there. I can't imagine that would ever happen. Or people who are older, you got to go in this line. People who are younger, you go in this line. I mean, think about the fact that in the rental business for years, there were apartments that wouldn't allow children in apartments because they wanted only adults. They didn't want kids who were riding around on their bikes and whatnot, and so a lot of people didn't want kids around. Well, there was a big effort to sort of break down that particular sort of exclusion. So now I think in most places, I think children are allowed because you really can't push them out. I think the only exception is if it's a government-funded senior place where obviously that wouldn't make sense to have children living in a place in which there's some sort of home care element to it. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But what I'm saying is that insurance companies are able to divide people and sort people out in ways that are probably a little bit less common. And that is smokers, non-smokers, males, females. Males and females pay different rates for insurance products. I don't know if you're aware of that. They pay different rates. Married people pay different rates than unmarried people. And these are all things that I can't think of anywhere else in the economy which private actors sort people and charge them different prices based upon characteristics that are purely demographic. Now, the one thing that they don't do anymore because it's such a legal issue now is by race, because obviously their civil rights laws are very much protective of that, as they should be. In fact, they probably should have gone further, arguably in some of these other areas as well. But that was once, though, a very common delineator also. It was a basis of discrimination that was widely practiced. And but today, insurance companies are able to sort people into pools. Now, and it sounds like I'm being critical. I guess maybe I sort of am, but they do it because they're trying to price their product better, and that they know that they're better able to determine outcomes when they know that smokers are more risky, more uncertain, have greater uncertainty of outcomes than do non-smokers. By the way, I had a client once that was an insurance company that offered car insurance to non-smokers, not health insurance, car insurance to non-smokers. And I met the owner of the company. It was a very small company, but they were extremely profitable, believe it or not. And I said, why? I go, are you sure? I go, car insurance? I go, you sure it's not health insurance? He goes, no. And he said that they determined, that he had worked for years in insurance to determine that people who smoke are more dangerous drivers than people who are non-smokers, because they're filling around their cigarettes, they're lighting cigarettes, they're putting ashes out, they're throwing cigarettes around, they're dealing with smoke and all this. And he said there's a very definite characteristic. So again, I can't think of any other industry, private sector, that deals with such delineation of slicing and dicing people and dropping them into buckets. And so, and one other thing, this is why it's such a unique and different industry. The other difference is the fact that these goods tend to be paid up front for the most part. This is a product that we pay for ahead of time. And so if we don't use it, then there's no way to get your money back. There are some exceptions. I think there are some negotiated issues in the corporate world where they simply bill you. And they understand that the corporation will pay the invoice. It's not always. For individual transactions, it's almost always the fact you have to pay it up front, whatever the policy is, insurance, life insurance, homeowners insurance, whatever. And so selectivity is common. Now, I mentioned this a bit earlier, and that was, this industry is unusual in the sense that if you think about, if you're going to buy a car, they'll say, hey, I don't want to sell you a car. I don't like you. It's probably not real common. If your money is green, they usually take it, right? But insurance companies are one company that simply picks and chooses who they want to do business with. And if they don't want to do business with you, they'll tell you they don't. I tried for a couple of occasions to buy car insurance through Geico, and they're extremely selective. And I don't know what the criteria are. They didn't really make that clear. But I was turned down on both occasions. And I was told later that it's because of the fact that they want older drivers. They want people who've never had any kind of tickets or anything. And I mean, they want the best of the best. And as a result, they're extremely selective. I mean, I can't think, I've never gone to Walgreens, they say, hey, get out. We don't like your looks. I mean, it's that sort of thing. And also poor profit. This is an important thing to note. Sometimes people wonder why insurance companies do what they do. They do it because of actors. And by the way, there was, particularly life insurance, up until 20 years ago or so, there were a number of life insurance companies that were so-called mutual companies, and there are still some around, but they're becoming fewer and fewer. And they engaged in what was called demutualization. That is, they became just regular stock companies like, like Boeing and Microsoft and all that, where they were just for-profit companies. Mutuals are these entities which are maybe they're a little bit outdated, where theoretically it's owned by their policyholders. There's still examples. I think New York Life and Northwestern Mutual are still that, but they're becoming more and more for-profit and operate like other for-profit actors. And so I bring this up, even though it may be completely obvious, but the reasons why are they do it, not because they're trying to achieve some social end, as is achieved through social insurance, but some for-profit end. And so I bring that last point up only because it is a segue to what we call social insurance, which is government-provided insurance. There are a number of different programs here. And I think it's probably not just for time constraints. I'll have to put this off. I'll pick this up on Monday. I'll talk about this. Then I want to sort of circle back a bit to talk about one final bit that's not discussed in your text in chapter 16, but I think it's important because it sort of brings together the last bit of regulation into our discussion, because I like to involve all the actors, economic actors, in our discussion of micro before we wrap this up. So I'll circle back to them. Then we'll get into the final bit, which deals with international dimension. So the questions for me about anything before we call it a week? Have a great weekend. See you all on Monday.